All right, so today is September 10th, 2022. My name is Kevin Yee. I'm the interviewer, and I'm here with Mr. David Hanten, who is a veteran of the Air Force and also my scoutmaster from Boy Scouts. So, thanks a ton for coming today. Um,
Sure, it's my pleasure.
yeah. Can you start by telling me where and when you were born?
Yeah, I was born in Minneapolis. Would have been July 1st, 1968.
Yeah. And who are your parents and what did they do?
My father was Nick Hanten, the namesake of the Nick Hanten that you know, and
Yeah.
my mom was Pat Hanten, and my mom worked with the elderly. She ran a senior citizens high-rise in South Minneapolis. My dad was a school teacher until he took early retirement and became a deacon of the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
So that's what they did.
Yeah. And growing up, did you have any kind of like military background or did you know what you wanted to do?
Just a little bit. My dad was a Korean War vet. Never
Hmm.
talked about it, as is kind of the norm for people of his, generation. But I knew that he'd served, and we had some photos or whatnot around the house. So that was about it. Um, I entered the military in '85, and it was just at the time when things were starting to sort of look up after sort of a dark period of time for the military between the mid to late '70s and the early '80s. And I entered the reserves. Yeah, kind of a long story, but I was a reservist for most of my military career.
Yeah. And do you remember what like moment or chain of events motivated you to join the military?
Not exactly. To tell you the honest truth, it was in my junior year or so of high school. I decided to do it, and I talked with my folks about it. I actually ended up starting. I retired out of the Air Force. My first 8 years in the military were in the Army Reserve, so I had enlisted as Private E1, the lowest rank in the Army Reserve, in October of my senior year of high school. And so somewhere in there was when I decided to enlist in the military. And I think it was just, I knew I was going to have some college expenses, and that would help with that as well because my parents didn't have a great deal of money at the time.
Yeah. Um, do you remember how your parents felt about you joining?
Uh, my dad was a mixture of excited and filled with trepidation about it. At the time, my mom didn't really talk about it too much, but their generation was one that it was much more regular than it is nowadays. So they were pretty accepting. They had to sign the paperwork, believe it or not, because I was only 17 when I enlisted in my senior year of high school. So they were
Yeah.
fine with it.
And did anyone from school find out that you were joining?
They did, yeah.
Yeah.
They knew about it because just like now with the Instagram version of your senior year where you're going to go to college thing, we didn't have that, but we had everybody kind of knew where everybody was going. So yeah,
Yeah.
everybody was aware.
So when did you go off to like your first training event or
I left for basic training in mid June of '86 and was down there for about 5 months. My training took place at Fort Jackson in South Carolina.
yeah. And do you remember what that was like?
It was a real bummer.
Uh,
I'm not gonna lie. It's one of these things that my dad told me when before I left that he said he's glad he did it and glad that he never had to do it a second time. And that's how I feel about it too. It was I'm glad I did it. It was a great experience, but it's not anything you really want to repeat.
yeah.
So anyway, I did in fact repeat it because I had to go to officer training school then in the Air Force. And so
Yeah.
despite saying that, I actually did it twice. Anyway.
Yeah. What were some of the things they taught you to do there?
Shoot, move, and communicate. Yeah, it was there was a lot of discipline, a lot of kind of sort of the boring routine of basic training that you may have seen, where you're spending a lot of time standing in formation, but we spent a solid 3 of the 8 weeks of basic training was spent on the rifle range. Probably shot 10,000 rounds of ammunition. Just learning how to be an excellent shot, really more than anything else, and to be a part of a unit. Sort of that understanding that you had to learn to be a member of a team bigger than yourself.
Yeah. Was any part of that like difficult for you or did it mostly go smoothly?
Oh, it was fine. didn't love PT. Nobody really loves. Yeah, some people love physical training, but it's
Yeah.
it was all right. A lot of push-ups and sit-ups and running, and that part of it was I I I could do it. I didn't love doing it. But the uh, the rifle range was great fun. Shooting some of the other weapons that you learn in basic training was fun to do, an experience, but it's not something that I don't recall a ton of it, but it was there.
Yeah.
That's about it.
You remember like any of the people you were with or the drill instructors you had?
I still do. Some of those things you'll never forget. Drill Sergeant Archer was probably 6'8", 6'9", and built like an absolute wedge. I will remember him till the day I die. He was the first drill instructor I came across in basic training. Yep, you don't forget that.
Was it like a lot like the movies and how they portray that, or was it a
Yeah,
lot?
like I always tell my kids, it's just like maybe Full Metal Jacket, except they can't punch you anymore. And they nowadays, I don't even think they're allowed to curse, or there's rules about cursing, but that wasn't a thing when I was going through basic training in the '80s. So there was a lot of curse words. There was a lot of angry intimidation kind of. It's all to an end. So they're not bad people, but they it's designed to put people under stress to help with the team building process, and they do a good job of it. So it's a kind of similar to what you'd see in some of those movies that shows basic training. Yeah.
Yeah. And then after basic training, did you have any like specialized training or
Yes. So in the Army Reserve, I started out. Everybody in the Army Reserve kind of has two jobs: a combat kind of job, and then but primarily you have a normal duty. My normal job in the Army Reserve was as a personnel information systems person, and so I basically it's like kind of it's quasi IT, human resources, somewhere in between, sort of the two of them, and so that was I went to training on that. When I got back to my unit, I was also assigned an additional duty as a 60 gunner, M60 machine gunner. So I learned that. Went to a couple weeks of training up at Camp Ripley for that process as well. So all in all, the training took 7 months.
yeah. And after that, you were activated into the reserves.
Right. And so I, generally speaking, did part-time work for the reserve unit until I was mobilized for 4 months for the first Gulf War, would have been in 1990 through early 1991, I believe. But I didn't go overseas. I was mobilized and sent to Fort McCoy in Wisconsin for 4 months. And then the war ended so quickly that I never ended up going overseas.
Yeah. So during all of this, did you have like a civilian job or something you did when you weren't in the reserves?
Yeah, I was a college student for most of that. And then around the time I was wrapping all that stuff up, I was working as a flight instructor in the civilian world, kind of learning to get my flight training. And then around the time I got back, right after I got back from the 4 month mobilization, in that would have been the early '90s, my reserve unit was eliminated, and so that's when I switched over to the Air Force.
Yeah. So was the army mostly like a secondary focus for you during this time?
It was, exactly. It was nice to have a backup, in the
Yeah.
sense of but it was definitely a second job. Being a college student was my first job, and then being a flight instructor was my first job, and so it was definitely an extra layer of trying to stay busy and everything, but or trying to keep from being overly busy, I guess is a better way to put it.
Yeah. So, when were you activated for the War on Terror and those events?
That would have been in December of 2001. So the war, of course, kind of the things got rolling in Afghanistan, I think, in late September, early October. But my reserve unit, so by this time I had done the branch transfer. My reserve unit went away and I switched over to the Air Force. And then within about a year in the Air Force Reserve, I had gone through a commissioning program to become a second lieutenant.
Yeah.
And by this point, it would have been around, yeah, so late 2001, a couple or months or so after 9/11. I had been laid off at Northwest Airlines at the time. I was flying as an airline pilot for Northwest Airlines, and that job kind of really went away with all. There was a lot of us, and many hundreds of us got laid off at the time, and in my tiny career field that I was in of finance in the Air Force, everybody knew everybody, and the word got back to headquarters that I'd been laid off, and they needed some extra help down in Georgia at the headquarters of Air Force Reserve Command. So they mobilized me and brought me down to Georgia for the start of about 6 years worth of active service.
Yeah. And since this was like a few months after 9/11, did that event like change how you viewed your time in the service?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It was definitely it was a lot more meaningful, frankly, and a lot more real when this stuff had happened right in the United States and
Yeah.
had a profound impact on everybody's life. The whole country was together, and it really, everybody, every time I showed up at a gas station with my uniform on my way to or from the reserve unit, like people were ready to give me a hug. So it was definitely it was an interesting time for the country, and it certainly made sometimes serving in the military can feel a bit like a job, and that made it feel more like a calling.
Yeah. So, did you have any kind of transition period or training before you went fully active?
Nope, that's part of the reserve deal is that you're supposed to be ready. So I'd had some,
Oh, yeah.
the training that I'd gone through in the, when I went off to my OTS program and a couple of finance courses that I had to attend that were, not particularly long. But so when things got going, they mobilized me and they sent me down there, and I was expected to be able to jump in and do my job right away, which I did.
Yeah. And your job was finance, was it?
Yeah, and so what I did in Georgia when I was mobilized was I was a budget officer for the headquarters of Air Force Reserve Command. I did kind of war-related finance work, so to speak, things associated with the funding of the reserve units that were going over, participating in the war effort.
Yeah. And how was like Air Force finance different from like a civilian job in finance?
Oh, it's definitely different. The government has such strict rules about accountability for every nickel that the government approves. There's a thing called the Anti-Deficiency Act that is makes it a criminal offense to basically lose track of money that the government has apportioned
Yeah.
to you, and so the rules are really strict compared with sort of accounting at a Fortune 500 company or something like that. And the other part about the active duty in that piece is that there's a lot more cash because when our paying agents go overseas, they transact the government's business in cash overseas. Because if you're in some small town in Afghanistan or Kyrgyzstan or something like that, they're not going to take. They probably don't take a credit card. So
Yeah.
and you have to have special procedures for handling cash because people can run away with it, frankly. So you have to really be careful about how it's handled.
Yeah. So then while you were in Georgia, what was an average day like for you?
It was pretty typical. My wife and kids came down for a portion of it. They were there for about 5 months of my year that I spent down there, and then after the year in Georgia, I had spent another close to 5 years working full time for the Air Force in the Twin Cities. But at the time when I was in Georgia, they came down for a portion of it, so it was nice to have my family here. The rest of the time, it was just 70 hours a week of working. Typical day, I would go swim at the gym for my physical training, and then I would clean up, head to the office by 7:30 in the morning, and I'd work until 5, 6, 7 o'clock at night, and then back to the dorm. So that was really pretty much it.
Yeah. And then what were the living conditions like?
Oh, they were fine. The Air Force is different than some of the other services, right?
Yeah.
a bad day, or bad like location to be working in the Air Force. You're like pressing the remote, going, my HBO doesn't work. So it's not nearly as austere a course as the Army has it. So it was actually pretty easy to I was they had a furnished apartment set up for me. I think by the end of that.
And so were you ever updated on like the stuff happening on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan?
We were, but nothing that you wouldn't see on the news 2 or 3 days later. Nothing, nothing too top secret-ish kind of.
Yeah,
My job didn't really, go that direction, so to speak.
yeah. So would you say you were like pretty detached from the conflict itself?
Uh, yes. Well, yes and no. I mean, I knew people from my reserve unit that were heading on over there,
Yeah,
um, but I didn't go over there myself. By the time the war started, I was at a rank that they didn't really need people of my. I was a kind of a relatively medium to high rank in the Air Force Reserve, and so there wasn't much use for the Air Force would send lieutenants over there to do the paying agent jobs and stuff like that. They didn't want an Air Force major over there, so um, uh, anyway, that was uh, so no. The war. We were kind of isolated from it, frankly, in the headquarters of Air Force Reserve Command. Kind of a few different layers of management between you and people that are actually serving over in the theater.
yeah. And what was the unit you served in like? Did you have like a lot of people alongside you doing similar jobs?
I did. I was the officer in charge of the finance office up here in the Twin Cities with a staff of 14 people working for me. And we ran the weekend. There was a civilian cadre that would do it as well for part of the day, and then we would handle it. Keep the reservist side of things running financially for the reserve unit.
Yeah. So were you always in Georgia or did they move you around a bit?
A lot of what they call TDY in the service, which stands for temporary duty. I was typically in a typical year for the 6 years that I was full time. I would spend about 3 months of that on the road, usually in 2 week increments, various places, all over the United States primarily. One time I went to Germany, and that was it.
Oh, yeah. And since it was like a 5 year service period, do you have like any iconic memories that just represent that time for you?
Um, so yeah, sending my own people over to people that work for me in the reserve unit over to Spain and downrange to be paying agents. I can definitely remember that, or having them call back on the sat phone to talk to us about stuff was quite an experience. Certainly for me, the most formative stuff for me was it was very stressful for the family when I was going to be down in Georgia, unaccompanied for most of a year, and I will always remember driving around with my wife looking at places to live down there, and she was bawling her head up because just the thought of all this, it's pretty overwhelming at the time, and we didn't know, we didn't really know what was coming. So yeah, that part was it was very stressful, but nothing like the stress level that somebody serving in a different branch and serving in a more combat oriented, situation would be in. But it was stressful for us for sure.
Yeah. What do you think like the main like hardships that other finance officers like you faced during that time?
I think just the pace of operations and deployments and things like that are so 90 days for me is not a big deal now because my kids are grown, but to be sent somewhere for a 90 or 120-day temporary duty tour, there's only so many times you want to be gone for 120 days when your kids are young. And if I'd have stayed if I'd have stayed in longer than I did, I retired at the end of that process. But there's just many of my colleagues would end up going overseas for 120 days, and that's a long time to be away from the family. Even though it's not the same as being in a tent or being in, certainly out in a forward operating base or something. But it's still a drag. The Air Force, we used to joke about the Air Force being the non-military branch of the military, but it's still it's still service, and it's still having to
Yeah.
put yourself on an airplane and go overseas.
So, when did this service period come to an end, and where were you at the time?
I retired in January. I can't recall the exact date. January of 2006. I was a a major in the Air Force Reserve. I retired out of the Air Force Reserve and then went right away to work back to work at the airline for Northwest Airlines at the time, soon to be Delta. And so I had a plan for that I was going to leave the reserve. You know, the timing was right for me to go back to work at the airline, and so I left. Um, I left the service. I had enlisted at such a young age. Normally, people, you know, most of my colleagues that were majors, they'd have to wait until they were 42 or 43 to be eligible for retirement. But because I enlisted as such a young man at 17, I was able to take a normal 20-year retirement at age 37.
Yeah.
And Nick was only 2.5 years old, and I really wanted to spend some time with the family. So.
Yeah. Um, what was it like to just transition back to normal life after being an officer for so long?
You know, it was not bad. I mean, I just switched careers to flying jets again, which is something I love to do. And in terms of the reserve commitment at the time went away, and so like that extra couple of weekends a month and a couple of weeks of TDY travel per year, that got to be it got to be a real burden when the kids are young. That's asking a lot of people to do that. So it was I missed my reserve colleagues for a few months, and then kind of never looked back after that.
Yeah. Um, did you ever miss anything else about military life, or not really?
Oh yeah, it's the family, the sense of family that you have with your people in your reserve unit. They're people. Some of my closest friends I ever made in my life were in my reserve unit. It's just it's a real bonding experience to serve together like that.
Yeah. And do you still stay in touch with anyone from the reserves?
Yeah, a handful of them, mostly through work here. There's a handful of them that I come across. There's some of them that I just haven't seen in forever, though, and I wish if I had a chance, or if I had more time, I would at some point I probably will try and reach out and reestablish those connections. But it's not uncommon in the military for people to lose track because there's so much moving around the country and whatnot.
Yeah. So I guess like all of the past veterans I've talked to have really like also said that the community was a big part that they may have missed or at least really enjoyed. Um, is there anything like specific about military life that you think builds such a strong community?
I think that the act of service itself is it's a common uh, and there's certainly different levels of it. People who serve in a combat unit together they have a real bond that's it's impossible to break. But even in the sort of typical, most people are not actually combat soldiers in the military. Um, it just the shared experience of basic training and OTS and all these different other things make it so that it's uh, we have that shared experience together and a shared set of values that just make people really close.
Yeah. So, after you were like fully out, did you have like a reunification process with your previous community or like old friends?
Yeah, not quite the same when you're a reservist because there's a little more free flowing between the two because the reserve job is kind of 1 weekend a month. When I was full time, I was my last 4 years of full time service were here in the Twin Cities, so I was already among work colleagues and friends and things like that. So it's uh, not quite as jarring as having been overseas for a year and then coming back to So it was a lot easier for me to integrate than some military service members.
Yeah. So, what did you go on to do for a living after you left?
Worked as an airline pilot, and I've been doing that ever since. I'm a captain for Delta Airlines, and I've been here since on and off since 2001, minus the 6 year furlough. I've been here since about minus the furlough, about 17 years, I guess it is.
Yeah. And then nowadays, is there like anything that still ties you back to military service, or are you pretty
Yeah,
disconnected?
mostly disconnected, but we do have a shared set of values because so many members of the airline here,
Yeah.
probably a good 40% are military veterans. So
Oh,
I still run into people that I served with.
Yeah. Um, this is like kind of a loftier question, but how do you think your service changed you as a person?
Oh, I think that, the thing about the most important part of being a member of the service is the idea of integrity. And I think that that's a lesson that I never, everybody has it in some measure, but one thing they really instill is, that the idea of not uh, lying, cheating, or stealing, or tolerating those who do. And some of the values that the military instills, I think, you never really grow out of that. It's kind of like being an Eagle Scout. Once you earn the rank of Eagle, you're going to be an Eagle for the rest of your life. And that's kind of the way that being a veteran is a little bit.
Yeah. Um, if you could go back to like yourself in high school, would you make that same choice to join the Army Reserves again?
Oh, I for sure would. I don't know. Who knows? Maybe I would start with the Air Force instead of
Yeah.
having switched over like I did, because the Air Force is, they both have their advantages and disadvantages, of course. But I don't think I'd change a thing, to tell you the honest truth. I enjoyed it.
Yeah. Um, what kind of like life lessons do you think you learned from your time in the service?
Well, try and act with a sense of honor and responsibility. And one of the values that the Air Force always instills is an idea of selfless service. So service comes before yourself. And that doesn't necessarily mean your job comes before yourself, but service to other people and service to the community and whatnot comes before you do. I think that's really important.
Yeah. And then is there anything you wish that like more people knew about veterans?
That's a good one. Uh, no, I guess I wish that there were more people that engaged in the process. I wish maybe that there was a larger pool of, let's say, reservists out there or something like that, or that federal service was a. I don't necessarily think it would a draft to be a good idea, but to some extent, it was easier when there was a you know, more people had experienced it through the draft and more people had been in service, so that even things like understanding how healthcare works for veterans, a lot of people that provide healthcare out there just don't understand that process.
Yeah. Do you think that like the general public uh perceives veterans accurately?
I think so. I think they do an all right job with it now. For when I was a young man, that was not always the case, because I was post Vietnam, and it was kind
Yeah.
of hard to be a vet back then. About the time I was coming in, things were changing a little bit to having a more wholesome opinion of veterans and military service.
Yeah. So have you kind of watched that just general attitude on the military slowly switch over the years?
Yeah, I certainly, it ebbs and flows. And in the late '90s, it was back to kind of, do we really need this again? Mid '90s maybe. And then by the time 9/11 came again, people realized what an essential portion of the country it was. And so yeah, it goes back and forth, and I've seen a lot of it over the years. But they did, I think it's normal and healthy to see some of that.
Yeah. So I guess like with your service background, how does that affect the way you view more modern events in the world, like the war in Ukraine or the withdrawal from Afghanistan?
Well, I think, we've the service is kind of like, I think it should be rarely used, but it needs to be ready to be used. And Ukraine's a great example of why that is. We need to be ready to support them, and they need to be ready to, defend their country. Here in the U.S., we have a little bit different. We have these, natural borders with the oceans on either side, and Canada to the north and Mexico to the south. It's not quite the same situation as they have in Europe, but it's a good life lesson that a military has to play a part in the entire public life of the country. It doesn't have to play a big part, but it has to be there.
Yeah. Well, I guess I don't have many more questions. Do you think there's anything that we missed or like any other
No, I,
subject?
I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you about it. I don't get to
Yeah.
kind of reflect back on it very often, so this is great.
Yeah. And then just last of all, is there any kind of message you'd want to leave for people who might watch this interview?
No, it's, I guess the only thing I'd have to say is that it was my honor to serve. And people say thanks for your service all the time, but I got far more out of it than the service gave to me. So it was an honor for me to have participated in the military.
Yeah. Well, that's about all I have. So thanks a ton. I guess I'll just stop the recording now and then, yeah.
Okay, well, sounds good.